Imagine stepping back in time, 12,000 years ago, a world completely unfamiliar, before cities, before nations, before written records. Humans lived in small, mobile groups, constantly moving with the seasons. They followed the herds, gathered wild plants, and lived in an intimate relationship with the natural world. They were not the brute force savages often portrayed in media. Rather, they were incredibly adaptive, deeply understanding their environment, animal behaviors, and the rhythms of nature. Their lives were simple, but far from primitive. These early humans had the same intelligence, emotional depth, and potential for complex problem-solving that we do today. They were strong and resilient, living in a fluid balance with the world around them. The human species was evolving, thriving in a world that was constantly shifting. Yet they had no permanent settlements. But then, something changed. A fundamental shift in how humans interacted with their world. And that moment marked the birth of civilization itself. The end of the nomadic era. For tens of thousands of years, humans lived as hunter-gatherers, always on the move, following the patterns of the animals they hunted and the seasons that dictated plant growth. These were societies built on mobility, with a deep connection to the earth and its cycles. Their survival depended on understanding the land, the animals, and the weather. But around 12,000 years ago, the world began to change. The Earth was emerging from the Ice Age, and the climate shifted, becoming warmer and more stable. These changes opened up the Fertile Crescent, a region that would become the birthplace of agriculture. The land in this area, rich in resources, allowed early humans to experiment with planting crops, domesticating animals, and settling in one place. The first steps toward what we recognize today as civilization happened in this region. Human groups, who once followed the animals, began to plant seeds. The process wasn't sudden, it took time. But eventually, people stopped migrating and began to settle in permanent communities. The rise of agriculture, a revolutionary change. The shift from hunting and gathering to farming was one of the most profound revolutions in human history. It wasn't just a new way of getting food, it was a change in how humans related to their environment. In the Fertile Crescent, the Natufians were among the first to adopt a semi-sedentary lifestyle around 12,000 years ago. They planted wild grains and started to experiment with domesticating animals like goats and sheep. This was revolutionary because it allowed them to produce surplus food, more than they could eat in one season, and store it for the future. This surplus of food allowed these early settlers to stay in one place. For the first time, human communities could be organized around agriculture, not hunting. This transition changed everything. Human societies grew in size, and the need for new social structures and organization became apparent. But it also came with challenges. Farming required hard work and new skills, planting, harvesting, and keeping animals from predators. With these changes, the need for tools, planning, and cooperation increased. The ability to grow more food than needed also led to the emergence of new social hierarchies. Surplus food allowed people to specialize in different roles. Some became farmers, while others became artisans, traders, or religious leaders. And this shift in roles would lead to a more complex society with different levels of wealth, power, and status. The challenges of settling down. With the ability to grow food and build permanent settlements came a new set of challenges. How do you store food for the long term? How do you keep it from spoiling or being eaten by pests? How do you defend your crops from animals and other humans? The answer came in the form of permanent structures. The first permanent homes were no longer made from temporary materials like animal skins or tree branches. Instead, people built homes out of stone, wood, and later brick. These homes were sturdy and meant to last, providing shelter for families and a place to store food. But with the move to permanent settlements came a change in how people lived together. As people began to live in larger, denser communities, social hierarchies began to emerge. Unlike the egalitarian societies of nomadic groups, these early farming communities began to develop different levels of status based on access to resources like food, land, and tools. The more land and resources one controlled, the more power one held. And this created the first inequality in human societies. The rise of kings and social hierarchies. The creation of permanent settlements marked the beginning of social stratification. The first cities were not just places for people to live. They were centers of power and governance. Leaders emerged, and with them, the idea of organized society. In the early agricultural societies of the Near East, kings and rulers began to emerge, often claiming divine sanction for their authority. These leaders, backed by religion and political might, began to consolidate power. They controlled the land, the resources, and the people. As cities grew, rulers needed help managing resources and maintaining order. This led to the development of administrative systems. These systems allowed rulers to control food distribution, collect taxes, and organize labor. For the first time in human history, centralized control and governance became the norm. But with centralized power came inequality. The elite, kings, priests, and wealthy landowners, controlled the resources, while the majority of the population, peasants, laborers, and slaves, had little power or wealth. This created a sharp divide between the ruling class and the rest of society, a divide that would persist throughout history. The role of religion in early cities. As cities grew, religion became an even more integral part of life. In early agricultural societies, religion had been central to community life. But with the rise of cities and kingdoms, it took on a more formalized role. The early rulers were not just political figures, they were also religious leaders, often seen as divine or chosen by the gods. This divine right to rule was a way to legitimize the power of kings and pharaohs. Temples were built not just for worship, but as centers of political and economic power. Priests and kings often worked together to maintain control over the people. In Mesopotamia, for example, the ziggurats, large stepped pyramids, were not just religious monuments. They were symbols of the king's power. The king's ability to build these grand structures was seen as a sign of his divine favor. Temples were also used to store grain and other resources, making them centers of both religion and economy. Religion in these early cities wasn't just about worship. It was about maintaining order and securing the stability of the state. It was a tool used by rulers to justify their power and influence over the people. The birth of civilization. This shift from nomadic life to settled agricultural societies marked the birth of civilization. It was a slow and gradual process, but over time, humanity moved from small, egalitarian groups to large, complex societies with kings, priests, and armies. The birth of agriculture allowed humans to settle in one place, build cities, and form kingdoms. But with these advances came new challenges: inequality, warfare, and disease. The rise of social hierarchies, the centralization of power, and the development of writing and religion were all part of the evolution of civilization. As we look back on this process, we can see that the birth of civilization was not just a leap forward for humanity. It was a trade-off. Civilization allowed us to build great cities, create wealth, and develop new technologies. But it also brought with it the challenges of inequality, warfare, and environmental degradation. The birth of civilization marked the beginning of a new chapter in human history, one that we are still writing today. The rise of cities, birth of complex societies, the transformation of human life. As the practice of agriculture took root, permanent settlements were established. Humanity's shift from a nomadic existence to a settled one didn't just change how people lived, it reshaped the very structure of human societies. Instead of wandering in small groups, human beings began organizing themselves into communities that were anchored to the land. These settlements grew into cities, and as they grew, they became the centers of power, culture, and knowledge. This shift from hunter-gatherers to urban dwellers didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual transformation, but one that fundamentally changed humanity's relationship with the planet. No longer did humans rely solely on hunting and foraging. They were now capable of controlling their environment. They could plant crops, raise animals, and store surplus food for the future. As these agricultural societies began to form, something else emerged: a new layer of complexity in social structure. With the rise of cities, people had to organize not just around food production, but around a new set of needs: defense, trade, governance, and the management of resources. The cities of the ancient world weren't just places of habitation, they were places of innovation. Early city-states became the birthplace of government, writing, religion, and technology. The birth of writing, the need for record-keeping. One of the most important innovations that emerged from these early cities was the invention of writing. Before the rise of cities, human knowledge and history were passed down orally. But as societies grew in size and complexity, the need to record information became more pressing. How would you manage trade, track resources, or enforce laws without a system of records? Around 3300 BCE, in the city of Uruk, in what is now modern-day Iraq, the first form of writing appeared: cuneiform. Cuneiform was not initially a system for storytelling or recording history. It was a method of keeping track of goods and resources. Sumerians used it to record the amount of grain stored in temples, to document trade transactions, and to manage the growing complexity of their societies. This system of writing marked the beginning of recorded history. The ability to write and record events was revolutionary. It allowed information to be passed down across generations, long after the original creators had passed away. The written word made it possible to formalize laws, create bureaucracies, and communicate over great distances. The role of religion, temples, and power. As early cities formed, religion played a central role in both everyday life and governance. In the earliest days, religion helped people make sense of the world around them. Gods and deities were invoked to explain the cycles of nature, the seasons, and the forces of life and death. But as cities became more complex, religion began to serve a more strategic purpose. It became intertwined with governance. In Mesopotamian cities like Uruk, the temples were more than just places of worship. They were centers of political power, control over resources, and economic exchange. Priests, who acted as intermediaries between the people and the gods, were often the most powerful figures in these early societies. They not only performed religious rituals, but also managed food storage, distribution, and other vital resources. The temple was the center of both religious and administrative life. In early civilizations, the king or ruler was often seen as divinely appointed, with the gods' approval legitimizing their reign. This made religion an integral part of governance. By claiming divine favor, rulers were able to consolidate their power and maintain control over their subjects. The rise of kings and centralized power. The emergence of writing and organized religion paved the way for the rise of kingship. As cities grew, so did the need for leaders to oversee their expansion and the distribution of resources. The first kings were not merely rulers. They were seen as representatives of the gods, and their authority was derived from divine approval. Sargon of Akkad, around 2300 BCE, was the first to unify multiple city-states into a single empire. By military conquest and strategic diplomacy, Sargon created the Akkadian Empire, the first empire in history. His reign marked the beginning of the concept of empire, vast territories controlled by one central authority. He didn't just rule over one city, but over many, and his power was absolute. Sargon's empire introduced a new level of organization in governance. Governors were appointed to oversee regions, and taxes were levied to fund the military and public works. This centralized administration was a crucial step in the evolution of political systems, paving the way for the great empires of the future, from Babylon to Persia and Rome. Social hierarchy and inequality. As cities grew and empires were formed, social hierarchies became more entrenched. Early agricultural societies were, to some extent, egalitarian. People worked together to produce food and shared the fruits of their labor. But as cities became more organized and as wealth began to accumulate, social divisions became more pronounced. At the top of the social pyramid were the rulers, priests, and wealthy landowners. They controlled the land and the resources, while the majority of the population, peasants, artisans, and laborers, had little to no wealth or power. The division of labor became more rigid, and the gap between the rich and the poor widened. The development of social hierarchies marked a significant shift from the more egalitarian societies of hunter-gatherers. This inequality became a defining feature of most early civilizations, and it laid the foundation for the class structures that would persist for millennia. The idea of ownership, of private land and resources, began to take hold. Slavery also became a key part of these early societies, with prisoners of war and debtors forced into servitude. In some cases, the wealthy elite owned slaves who worked the land or served as household servants. The institution of slavery, which would persist in various forms throughout history, became a cornerstone of many ancient civilizations. The birth of empires, Sargon and beyond. As we move into the era of the first empires, we see a shift in the political landscape. No longer were the city-states isolated from one another. Now they were interconnected through trade, war, and diplomacy. The first empires were built not just on the power of the king, but on the strength of the military, the economy, and the ability to control vast territories. Sargon of Akkad, as mentioned, was the first ruler to unify multiple cities into a single empire. His military prowess and ability to manage resources were key to his success. But as his empire grew, so did the challenges. Maintaining control over such a vast territory required constant military campaigns, administrative oversight, and the ability to keep the local rulers in line. Sargon's empire eventually fell, but the idea of empire lived on. Later empires, such as the Babylonian Empire under Hammurabi, would expand on the ideas introduced by Sargon, creating more sophisticated systems of law, governance, and military organization. Hammurabi's famous Code of Laws, for example, was one of the first written legal systems and influenced legal thinking for centuries. The technological and intellectual innovations. The rise of early civilizations was not just about building cities or creating empires. It was also about technological and intellectual innovation. As cities grew, so did the need for new tools, new technologies, and new ways of organizing society. One of the key innovations was the wheel, first used for pottery, but later adapted for transportation and warfare. The wheel revolutionized trade, allowing goods to be transported over long distances more efficiently. In warfare, it was used to create chariots, which would become one of the dominant forms of military transportation for centuries. Another crucial innovation was irrigation. As cities grew, so did the need to feed their populations. Irrigation allowed farmers to control the flow of water to their crops, ensuring that food could be grown year-round. This technological advancement allowed for larger populations to be supported, which in turn led to the growth of more cities. The foundations of modern civilization. The rise of the first cities, the creation of writing, the establishment of kingship, and the development of empires were all key moments in the birth of civilization. These early developments laid the foundation for the modern world, influencing everything from politics to trade to technology. The legacy of these early societies is still felt today. The political systems, social hierarchies, and technologies that emerged in these early civilizations continue to shape our world. The story of the first cities and empires is not just a historical one. It is a story that continues to unfold. The formation of empires, the legacy of early civilization. The first empires, Sargon and the Akkadian legacy. The rise of the first empires was not merely about conquering land. It was about consolidating power, establishing control over resources, and creating a lasting legacy. The Akkadian Empire, led by the ambitious and powerful Sargon, is the first true empire in human history. Sargon didn't just rule one city or region. He sought to unite multiple city-states under one central authority. Through a combination of military strength, political alliances, and divine legitimacy, Sargon forged an empire that extended across much of Mesopotamia. He became the first ruler to conquer a vast territory and rule over many different peoples, bringing them under one unified political system. Sargon's empire was a model for future empires and helped to spread Mesopotamian culture, language, and governance. However, Sargon's empire wasn't without its challenges. The task of maintaining control over such a large and diverse area required constant military campaigns, diplomatic efforts, and the management of resources. Despite these challenges, Sargon's legacy lived on, influencing the empires that followed, including the Babylonian and Assyrian empires, and laying the foundation for the idea of empire as we know it today. The rise of kings and the emergence of centralized power. One of the defining features of early empires was the concentration of power in the hands of a single ruler. These kings were often seen as divinely appointed, their authority legitimized by the gods. In ancient Mesopotamia, the king's role was not just political, but also religious. The king was considered the intermediary between the gods and the people, ensuring the proper functioning of society and the favor of the gods. The centralization of power that came with the rise of kingship was a necessary development for the growth of large empires. As cities expanded and populations grew, the need for centralized control over resources, trade, and defense became more pressing. Kings were not only military leaders, but also administrators, overseeing the collection of taxes, the construction of infrastructure, and the maintenance of order. The king's power was not just based on military strength, but on the ability to manage and organize resources. The first empires relied on a system of bureaucracy, with appointed officials responsible for overseeing different regions and sectors. This system allowed for the efficient management of vast territories, ensuring that resources were allocated where they were most needed and that laws were enforced. The role of religion in the expansion of power. Religion and kingship were deeply intertwined in the early empires. The rise of centralized power often went hand in hand with the establishment of religious systems that justified and supported the authority of the rulers. In Mesopotamia, Egypt, and later empires, kings and priests worked together to maintain control over their subjects. In Mesopotamia, the king was often depicted as the earthly representative of the gods, responsible for ensuring the prosperity of the empire. This divine right to rule was central to the king's legitimacy. Temples played a significant role in the empire, not only as centers of worship, but also as administrative hubs. The priesthood, which controlled these temples, often had significant political power, and in some cases, priests and kings were the same person. In Egypt, the pharaoh was considered both a king and a god. The idea of the divine ruler was taken to an extreme, with the pharaoh's power considered absolute and unquestionable. This concept of divine kingship was central to the stability of Egyptian society and played a significant role in the consolidation of power and the expansion of the Egyptian empire. Religion provided a unifying force within these early empires. It justified the ruler's power, provided social cohesion, and helped to explain the unexplainable. As civilizations grew, so did their need for religious systems that could bring people together, create moral codes, and legitimize authority. Social hierarchies and inequality. As empires expanded and societies became more complex, social hierarchies became more pronounced. The idea of a stratified society, with different classes and roles, became a defining feature of ancient civilizations. The rulers and elites at the top controlled the resources and wealth, while the majority of the population, peasants, artisans, and slaves, had little power or wealth. This shift from the egalitarian societies of early agricultural settlements to the rigid hierarchies of empires marked a significant change in human history. The rise of slavery was also a defining feature of these early societies. Slaves were often captured in war, forced into servitude due to debt, or born into slavery. They worked the fields, built the cities, and served the elites, providing the labor that made the empires function. While the elite enjoyed luxurious lives, the majority of the population lived in poverty, working long hours to produce the goods and services that fueled the empire. This inequality was not just economic, it was also social. The elites had access to education, religious leadership, and political power, while the lower classes were often excluded from decision-making and governance. The rise of writing, record-keeping, and bureaucracy. As empires grew in size and complexity, the need for record-keeping became essential. Writing was not just a means of communication, but a tool for governance. The first written records were created for administrative purposes, tracking the collection of taxes, the allocation of resources, and the distribution of goods. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians developed one of the earliest forms of writing, known as cuneiform. Initially used for keeping track of goods and resources, cuneiform evolved to include laws, historical records, and religious texts. The creation of written records allowed rulers to maintain control over their empires, ensuring that laws were enforced and resources were distributed according to their will. The rise of writing also allowed for the development of bureaucracy. As empires expanded, the need for administrators and officials to manage the growing complexity of society became more apparent. Writing made it possible to communicate across distances, issue decrees, and keep track of vast amounts of information. This was a key factor in the success of empires like the Akkadian Empire, Babylon, and Egypt, as it allowed for the organization and management of resources and people on an unprecedented scale. The legacy of early civilizations. The first civilizations laid the foundation for everything that followed in human history. From the invention of writing and the rise of empires to the development of social hierarchies and political systems, the legacy of these early societies is still felt today. The rise of cities, the birth of kingship, and the development of complex societies were all part of a larger process of human innovation. These early civilizations gave us the institutions, technologies, and ideas that would shape the course of history. But they also introduced challenges that we continue to grapple with today: inequality, warfare, and the exploitation of resources. The first empires were built on the backs of slaves and peasants, and their legacies are mixed with both triumph and tragedy. Despite these challenges, the civilizations of the ancient world created the foundation for the modern world. From the first written records to the development of cities and empires, these early societies left a lasting imprint on the world. Their ideas, technologies, and social structures continue to influence us today. The legacy lives on. As we look back on the rise of the first cities and empires, we can see that the legacy of early civilization is not just a story of ancient history, it's a story that continues to shape our lives today. The innovations and institutions that emerged in these early societies laid the groundwork for everything that came after: the rise of kingdoms, the birth of empires, the development of trade and technology, and the spread of ideas. The birth of civilization marked the beginning of humanity's journey toward the complex, interconnected world we live in now. It was a journey that started in the fertile lands of Mesopotamia and spread across the globe, from the cities of Egypt to the kingdoms of China, India, and the Americas. The legacy of these early civilizations is not just a part of our past, it is a part of who we are today. The ideas, technologies, and structures they created continue to influence the world we live in, and their impact will be felt for generations to come.